pleasantly.
Yeah. So I just started recording. I hope that's okay with everyone. I just thought that others would love who can't be here live would love to be able to hear the discussion afterwards. So I thought Ashton and I were talking about how to organize this first session, and I thought while we're eager to hear from those of you, meet those of you we don't know, hear a bit about yourselves and why you wanted to join us for this reading group. I thought it might sort of set the mood if Ashton and I just share briefly some reflections on chapter two of Riddles of Philosophy. We talked a bit about chapter one already. And then we'll open it up for each of you to share a bit about yourselves, having absorbed just a little bit of the content that we'll be studying. I thought that would be better than just going in cold to introductions. So, sound good? All right. Ashton, did you want to lead us in?
Yeah, sure. So hopefully everyone has, well, it's not a big deal if not, but hopefully everybody's seen the first video that we made introducing the text and the first chapter, and also, maybe read the second chapter. But I thought I would just begin by speaking a little bit about what he opens the chapter two with, which is speaking about this old picture consciousness that he uses the example of Pherecydes and Pythagoras as sort of um, where in the thinking of these two figures, we can see this development coming most into relief. And so, just as a reminder, Steiner's approaching the evolution of consciousness in the history of philosophy as a kind of symptomological approach. So he's like reading on the surface of the events and in the articulations, what he refers to as a kind of like subterranean process. And so in this moment where what he calls the old picture consciousness is sort of coming to, at least in this culture, uh, a close for some thinkers. Um, he says that there's a kind of split between what he calls the poetic image and thought, and that prior to this, he gives these examples in the chapter where he says the human being who was sort of could be characterized as being in this old picture consciousness experienced the activity, like for example rain or wind in the external world, that's sort of like the image, and that the activity behind that image was one and the same with the activity that the human being experienced within their own self, like if they were to move a limb. So there was like their arms. So there's something Owen Barfield in his book Saving the Appearances, which, if you've read it and reading the Riddles of Philosophy, I've noticed some striking echoes, I guess, in Barfield's work from this text. But he puts it like this, and he calls it original participation, this old picture thinking, which is the experience that uh, there's something on the other side of the phenomena. So what we perceive, the appearances we perceive, the activity on the other side of the phenomena is of the same essence as what I experience within me. So just characterizing that old picture consciousness, and how in Pherecydes and Pythagoras, the sort of riddle that is posed to them is connected with this sort of emerging self experience that thought facilitates. And especially in the case of Pherecydes, there's this threefold sort of cosmological vision of Kronos, Chthon, and Zeus, uh, and also he says Ophionis, which is sort of the mythic image of the kind of destructive or imperfect force at work in the world. And with Pherecydes, so prior to Pherecydes, there's the old picture consciousness. There's a kind of being just cut up in maybe the wise guidance of the world without so much of a sort of differentiated um, negotiation of that. But with Pherecydes, he says there's this burgeoning um, experience of a needing to understand the soul's origin in connection with something that exceeds the imperfect and perfect being mixed up together in experience. And so thought is sort of what facilitates uh, that distinction, I guess, between the sort of primordial good mothers and then the circumstance with Ophionis, where like the individual soul is caught up in the imperfection of the world. And so there's like the kind of freedom with this wedge that thought provides. He says multiple times, he compares thought to like a tool that almost serves the emancipation of the human soul. And so then he sort of traces that throughout the chapter. And one example I think that's just really great to show this contrast between the old picture consciousness and what's emerging with thought is when he brings up the prevalence of the oracles prior to the emergence of philosophy and even during it, where he says it was natural for the old picture consciousness to, he says, that this external world was able to express more through a special institution. So it made sense that a particular place would have a kind of numinous character and that revelation could arise, from a place in contrast to, because there's not this sort of like separation of the soul from the external world in the same way that arises with thought. Whereas when he brings up the example of Socrates over the centuries of thought's development, revelation then began to be understood as something that arises from the soul. So like the deep foundations of the soul, when through thought it's connected with the foundation of the world, with the example of Socrates, the daimon. And so at the beginning of the chapter, he says, Steiner, the essential process that is to be understood is the transformation of the more delicate organization of man or the human being. And so that's sort of what I was just describing, that there's a kind of gradual emancipation from being sort of determined by the wise speaking flow of the world, where the image is still united with a kind of intelligent content that speaks through the image, like with the example of Kronos and fire. Like there's something that's speaking through the image of fire. It's not just fire, and that's this kind of activity of time. And that this subtle organization of the human being is what he's tracing in that split between the wise, the formerly like old picture consciousness, wise image of the world, sort of informing the human being without self-consciousness, to the separation of the capacity for image making. So you have the poetic fancy and then the thought content, which is separate. So I'll stop there and I'll let Matt share.
Yeah, thanks, Ashton. It's, I think, difficult for us to live into the worldview of the ancient Greeks, who were just beginning to develop this capacity for abstract thought that now dominates our experience, really. And so, as you mentioned, Steiner's trying to observe the emergence of thinking in the ancient Greeks, though he says we could easily observe this occurring, a similar process in many other cultures, but he's chosen the Greeks because this is a book on Western philosophy. And, Pherecydes is not a philosopher that's typically included in histories of philosophy. Usually you start with Thales and the other pre-Socratic physiologoi who, imagined everything is water like Thales, or everything is fire like Heraclitus, and so on. But Steiner starts with Pherecydes because I think there's this more evident transition occurring in his thought, as you were highlighting, with these still kind of semi-mythic figures of Zeus and Kronos and Chthon, which Steiner likens to, like, if we were to translate it into conceptual thought, which he says is not how Pherecydes was observing or mythically perceiving these beings, or kind of somewhere between image and thought. He was perceiving these beings. We could say Zeus is like space, and Kronos is like time, and Chthon is like matter. But again, this is our conceptual reinscription of what for Pherecydes was still numinous and mythically charged, right? You mentioned Barfield. He talks about the residue of unresolved positivism in our attempts to observe the evolution of consciousness historically. And so when we look at the ancient Greeks, there's a tendency for us to think of, what Pherecydes was talking about, or what Thales or Anaximander, Anaximenes, etc., what they were describing as a kind of proto-science, then that they just weren't really clear in their thinking about nature yet. But as you were explaining to us, Ashton, they weren't thinking about nature yet. They were more in this emerging from this picture consciousness where, like, Steiner's trying to get us to imagine a time before a split between what we now think of as intellect or abstract thinking and imagination or sort of poetic fancy that artists engage in order to produce works of art. He says if you trace back the evolution of consciousness, there was a time where thought and imagination hadn't split yet, and it's a kind of mythic perception. So that what we conceive of as ideas for the ancient Greeks were more like perceptions, right? It was as if the world was thinking for them, right? And they hadn't yet distinguished themselves as the thinker of thoughts. It's as if the percept and the concept hadn't yet been severed, whereas for us, they very much are two different moments in the process of apprehending the world and reflecting upon it. And for Steiner, he's really trying to highlight in all of this, not just a history of philosophy, but, as Ashton said, a kind of transformation in our human organization, right? It's an evolution of consciousness, not just a history of ideas that he's trying to recount for us here. So Ashton spoke about Pherecydes and Pythagoras. I just want to say a bit about how ancient Greek philosophy developed from there, because Steiner ends up saying, going from Pherecydes all the way up to the Neoplatonists like Plotinus, that there's a sense in which all the possible relations that human beings could take to thought, to the thought world, seem to have been exhausted by these Greek thinkers. It's like, you have the pre-Socratics who are developing this, the first stirrings of a kind of physical conception of the world. And you have the first materialists like Democritus, and you have like Pyrrho, the first skeptic, and you run through all these modes of thought that seem like they're quite modern, really, and get rediscovered and played out over again in the subsequent history of philosophy. But there's a sense in which, as Whitehead put it, all of Western philosophy is a series of footnotes to Plato. Plato is already quite late in the story that Steiner is telling in this second chapter. But the basic idea is that there aren't that many new ideas for us to reflect upon in this realm of thought. There's obviously more evolution of consciousness that has transpired since then and that will continue to transpire. But in terms of abstract thought itself, the Greeks played it out pretty much. Maybe that's a contentious point, but that's what Steiner's saying. But let me just say a bit about what happens with Parmenides and then Plato and Aristotle. So Steiner talks about Parmenides and his student Zeno. You may have heard of Zeno's paradox. There's a way in which these thinkers, as Steiner puts it, were in search of a conception of the world that would be fully satisfying to this new thought capacity. Which is to say, in Steiner's terms, they were asking, how must the world be constituted so that it can be fully absorbed within my thinking? Because when Parmenides and Zeno looked out at the sensory world, right, because the percept and the concept now were starting to really become separated. In the perceptual world, they just saw everything changing. It was a plurality of different things. So there's this manyness, this multiplicity of the sensory world that never stays the same. And they thought this must be an illusion because thought wants to seize upon unity and permanence, right? And so for Parmenides, becoming is an illusion and only being is real. And for Zeno, when he's trying to apply these newfound capacities of thought and logic to the sensory world, he runs into these paradoxes and these contradictions, right? Like this paradox that he is famous for is the paradoxes of motion, where, if you say, Achilles is in a race and the tortoise is trying to catch up to Achilles, or it's the reverse. The tortoise is ahead of Achilles and Achilles is running behind. And if you think about it logically, that motion of Achilles behind is going to half the distance between himself and the tortoise, and then half it again, and then half it again. But you can continue to divide the remaining distance in half indefinitely. And it seems logically as though Achilles would never be able to catch up, right? Obviously, that's not true. We all perceive motion in a way that allows, or you could think of it in terms of an arrow being released at a target. Like the arrow will hit the target, even if logically, when we reflect upon that process of motion, it seems impossible. So this is the birth of a riddle of thought, you could say, for this early conception of the world. Steiner then talks about the Sophists, which typically are ridiculed in some of Plato's dialogues as kind of relativists who just want to teach people how to speak well rhetorically, but they're not really interested in the truth and so on. But Steiner kind of redeems the Sophists and acknowledged the way that they were bravely navigating the dangerous straits, hovering over this abyss, trying to develop a form of thought which would rest upon nothing but its own capacities. A kind of the Sophists were bravely sort of sailing out into the abyss of a thought that was disconnected from the mythic ground which had supported human beings before that. And it's not until Socrates, though, that this new capacity for thinking was able to kind of drop anchor and find some secure foundation, not in a spirit world beyond itself, but in the self. And so Socrates develops this dialectical method where it's not just personal opinions, right, that begin to be expressed, but Socrates had this confidence that no, through dialectic we can actually speak the order of the world itself, right? And so as Ashton was saying, rather than the oracle speaking as if being the world speaking to us, Socrates is developing this inner soul capacity by which we speak the order of the world out of our own inner depths, right? And so there's this transition, this inward transition occurring. I don't want to take too much more time going into Plato and Aristotle. You all probably know more about them than these other pre-Socratics, I would assume. But the basic idea is, Plato has this real spiritual longing for the world of ideas and thinks of all of our knowledge as a kind of recollection, whereas Aristotle just expresses as if as a matter of course, he applies thought to the world. He takes possession of the ideas he finds in things, orders them, classifies them, develops the rules of thought, logic, and all of the natural sciences that we still have. Aristotle is just a master. Steiner basically says everyone else is just an imitator of Aristotle's mastery of thought. And then, after Aristotle, for Steiner, he thinks there's basically a decline, right? There's the Stoics and the Epicureans and the skeptics and so on, who, like the skeptics in particular, they've torn the soul free from the ground of the world, and they're exploring the implications of this free thinking ability, but they don't yet find a ground to rest upon. And he talks about Philo applying thought to revelation, and Plotinus realizing the limits of thought and resorting to a kind of mysticism, this mystical union with the one that's beyond thought, and that's kind of the end of the development of this new thought conception, though the evolution of consciousness continues after that, which we'll see in subsequent chapters. So I'll stop there, and hopefully that gives you all a sense of the type of exploration that this book will invite us to engage in. And from there, unless you have anything to add, Ashton, we can ask everyone to introduce themselves.
Yeah, no, the only thing that I wanted to add was just, or maybe suggest, is to, so like when Steiner's talking about Plato and Aristotle, he describes like that this development's coming to a climax with them, and he says with Aristotle, it comes to like a kind of rest. And I think it's worthwhile to pay attention to. I would describe this as a kind of morphological language, that there's like almost like a botanical language, there's something that climaxes and then comes to rest with Aristotle, and then also starts to be oriented more towards the world. So like sort of bringing thought to things rather than this sort of internalizing. Yeah. Anyway, so I wanted to mention that, but now
Yeah.
excited to hear from everybody else.
Yeah, so let's just do popcorn. Whoever wants to go first. Just share who you are, where you are, and why you wanted to study this book with us. If no one goes, I'll call on someone. So.
Well, I'll go since on
Thanks,
my
John.
screen I'm on the top. So there we go. My name is John Severson. I live in Altadena, California, which is very close to Pasadena, if you know where that is, Southern California. And what has me intrigued with this discourse or dialogue is something I think both Ashton and Matt, you guys said in your YouTube video, where there is this kind of disconnect between our experience of the world and our current worldview that we kind of live in. It's this kind of materialistic kind of view that we can't quite reconcile with our own inner experience of consciousness, for example, like that. Of course, for me, philosophy always has to be grounded. It has to be something I can apply in my own life, or I'm like, why would I even study it? So that's kind of my eye in gleaning that kind of knowledge from this participation.
Thanks, John. Glad you could join us.
I'm going to play off a point John just made, which rings for me, which is on this, the way I guess Steiner put it somewhere early in this book, one of the prefaces or introduction or chapter 1, I forget where, but he essentially makes the point of the vital role of philosophy. It's not just some abstract occupation, that you you use your free time on or something, but it really gets to the vital root of what a human being is. And why that's important to me, both personally and professionally. I actually practice something called medical Heilkunst, which probably no one has quite heard that term, but you probably would have heard the term homeopathy. So what my practice in Heilkunst is, in our context here, is really, I'd call it the redemption of homeopathy to its true place as a romantic science or a Goethean science, in terms of understanding the full human being. We study Steiner professionally for our diploma, and I've never stopped studying. So anyways, this is my great interest in Steiner, is to always ground it in something real, something that feeds back into human health in a practical way, and my ability to understand that, what's going on with the patient, what's going on with myself, of course, as I'm my first and constant patient. But yeah, that's a little bit of an introduction to me. I didn't say about myself personally. I kind of call myself Canadian refugee living in Mexico, and indefinitely, who knows how long. And yeah, that's enough about me.
Wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. Good to have you with us.
I can go next if that's fine. I'm Matt, out of Lawrence, Kansas. I'm interested in this because Steiner has been kind of a character that I've been very interested in, kind of for historical reasons, and he has all these different books. Like, I didn't even know about this one. There's just so many of them. And I found this one really intriguing because you can't almost ever stop learning about philosophy and the history of philosophy from all these different angles, the way that they just kind of loop into each other. And so he has a different kind of way of doing that, a developmental way that I find really interesting, especially because, well, I didn't know about it, and I'm not that familiar with Ken Wilber's work, but I think it'll be interesting to compare it to him developmentally. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it'll be interesting, these different conceptions of the evolution of consciousness. Wilbur, a more contemporary attempt at this sort of study, and Steiner earlier in the 20th century. So yeah, thanks for bringing that perspective.
So, hello everybody.
Hi.
I'm Lorenzo Peirani from Italy. I'm an independent scholar. And actually, I've been interested in Steiner for a long time, about 15 or maybe 20 years. And actually, I'm writing a book, an essay about science and magic. And the first part, it's mostly a book of epistemology. And the ideas you find in Steiner, I'd like to demonstrate are shared as a basis from other esotericists like Aleister Crowley or Gurdjieff. And I also have a more academic approach. So through the works of Italian philosopher Enzo Melandri, which I don't know that anybody knows, but anyway, who works with a method similar to that of Foucault, a kind of archaeology. And archaeology, in that sense, is kind of going beyond phenomenology, treating the phenomenon as a sign, so going from phenomenology to semiotics, and then treating semiotics from the medical point of view, and so symptomatologically going beyond the sign to, let's say, derive an ontology. And so I think this links up very well with Goethe and Steiner, this book in particular, and that's why I'm here. Thanks.
Very interesting. Thanks for
Thank you.
joining us, Lorenzo. Go ahead, Stuart.
Thank you. I'm from Santa Cruz. I'm living in Santa Cruz, and I feel like I've been a philosopher since I was about 5. I suspect most people have been, but this seems to be, to a certain extent, it seems like most people stop uh, in a certain direction. And although you might say I was only part of the professional scene for a few years, been doing other things since, carpentry, massage, and so on to get by. I've never left it. And so I approached Steiner from a philosophical approach rather than from the anthroposophical approach specifically, although I'm interested in that. And so I'm basically kind of focused on the Steiner's Steiner's focus on the history of philosophy, the evolution of philosophy, and he seems to have found that really important. And he spent a lot of time laying that foundation for his esoteric work, it seems to me, and to everybody else. And I'm impressed by the way that he seems to have more absorbed Western philosophy rather than, say, having learned it as I've had to do, spend so much time at. And since that would be my primary focus, is understanding the way in which he absorbed philosophy and then wants to move it on to that next level. And having come across Matt's work a few months ago and started following some of his work. And when this group came up, it just seemed like, well, this is the place to be. This seems to be, I know you folks have broader interests, let's say, but you seem to have that specific interest shared by Robert McDermott, Tarnas, and so forth, and others. So I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Stuart. Not too far away, down in Santa Cruz there. Who's next?
I can go next. I'm Angus Hawkins, live in Sweden, so 9 hours ahead of you. So I'll be going to bed after this. Yeah, I picked up the philosophy of freedom for the first time 1994. So it's going on nearly 30 years, intensely interested in philosophy of freedom. It's like all the works preceding that, GA 123. Obviously Riddles of Philosophy falls into that category as well, but also deeply interested in the esoteric side as well. There are multiple reasons I'm here. I think one of them is actually, I came across Matt a few months ago when I was looking at the 12 worldviews. You did a lecture with, I'm not sure the name of the guy, but somewhere out in California, and I was particularly interested in investigating more of those 12 worldviews. I thought your presentation was interesting, showed a level of competence, which meant that I went and watched more of your material. And then Stuart, who I know from elsewhere, he pointed out that this was there. So I went and watched the video and thought, yep, I'll give that a go. Why not? So I'm not coming in here with any hopes or expectations. Let's see what we end up talking about. I know I'll be interested in the content, looking forward to some, as I say, some interesting conversations with you guys.
Great, thanks, Angus. That was Robert McDermott, who Stuart mentioned that I was giving that 12 worldviews talk with. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, I guess I'll go next. Hi, I'm Elizabeth, and I've been studying philosophy formally for a little over a year. I basically joined this group because I'm not familiar with Rudolf Steiner, and I really appreciate learning within community. I think it's one of the best ways to learn. I'm no longer a student. I am an instructor at a community college, so I just really appreciate these opportunities to be around people and have meaningful conversations. I am interested in Steiner's like mysticism and esoteric kind of ideas. I've always been kind of aligned with that within intellectual and philosophic thought. And I think it's really interesting how Steiner seems to have influenced various important aspects of human life, such as education and medicine. So I'm also interested in him as just a person as well. So thank you, glad to be here. And I'm from Colorado.
Yeah, great to have you here, Elizabeth. For those who don't know, Elizabeth co-hosts a sort of philosophy show, Philosophy in the Spotlight on Twitter, and then it's uploaded to YouTube after. I had the joy of joining for a session, was that last week? It's a lot of fun, so check that out. I think it's Chad and Josh left, yeah?
Yeah.
Go ahead,
Hi,
Chad.
my name is Chad Harris. Hope you guys can hear me. It's a new microphone. And I just moved from San Francisco to Haiku, Maui, and I'm really enjoying this space. I have never read Steiner. I'm an archetypal astrologer. I'm a student of Richard Tarnas, and I am deeply interested in the idea that archetypal astrology can serve as a spiritual science that unites and helps us engage with the world of ideas. The archetypal idea, recognizing that the symbol system unifies the relationship. It's a kind of a method of knowing higher worlds, if I'm understanding Steiner's concept correctly. And from Barfield, I feel like archetypal astrology has the capacity to serve as a vehicle towards final participation, towards bringing in even what Gebser describes as the aperspectival view that incorporates the previous modes of understanding together. And so, yeah, that's my direction and interest, and I'm deeply interested in Steiner's wisdom in cultivating a relationship with the numinous world. So that's why I'm here, and thank you. And I hope you put up with my questions and my naivete around Steiner's work. So thank you. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, glad you joined us, Chad. It seems like we have a mix of people very familiar with Steiner and others not at all familiar. So I think that's perfect. And I'm eager to see how, having studied with Rick Tarnas and his book Passion of the Western Mind, which is another, I think, participatory reading of the history of philosophy, to see how that compares with what Steiner is up to in this book. So, yeah. All right, Josh, you're up.
Hey, everyone. Yeah, I'm Josh, coming to you from Virginia Beach in Virginia in the US. And I'm a PhD student at the California Institute of Miracle Studies in philosophy, consciousness, and cosmology. So of course, I'm interested in the big cosmological questions, questions about, spirituality, unifying powers of the universe and how and why we believe in such things, and our spiritual practices surrounding that as well. And what is it we're believing in? Why are we doing these things? All those big questions. I think what drew me to this group is a couple of things. One is just a really concrete answer to that question, and that's that I know Steiner is a big influence not only in some of the faculty at PCC, but a lot of the people that we read in the sort of canon of texts there. So, but I have very little contact with the original works of Steiner. So I'm interested in delving into that I haven't done in my coursework at PC yet. So that's one reason. The other reason is the longer I try to be a philosopher and engage in this life work, I realize that I can't just do it myself. It has to be done in a community of people. And that exchange of light and ideas has to take place amongst us. And so when I saw this opportunity to come up to do that sort of outside CIS as well, I was very interested in that. So that's the other reason why I'm here too, is for the community.
Yeah, so great to have you here, Josh. So we've got about 15 minutes left. Let me just take a second to share the kind of rationale for hour-long sessions once a week. I think we could easily go on much longer, but in the Zoom format, I feel like an hour is just the right amount of time to keep the dialogue really at a high temperature. And undoubtedly, we will always end each session with more that we want to say, but that's great. Save it for next time, right? And we'll just keep stoking that fire. Next week, Ashton and I had some unfortunate scheduling things come up, so we're going to have to do this a little bit later on next Thursday afternoon, which I know might be difficult for those of you elsewhere in the world, but we'll switch back to noon again 2 weeks from now, noon Pacific. And there was, I forget who it was, I don't know if you're here, who suggested that we utilize another tool which would allow for a kind of asynchronous contribution to the ongoing dialogue, where we could upload short little clips when we have a thought throughout the course of the week, and anyone who wants to listen to that would be able to. Is that person here? Was that
That's
you, Jeff?
me.
Yeah.
Yep.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? Volley,
Just
is
for,
that what it's called?
I can speak to that briefly, but Matt, can you just add the detail to what you were saying? How far will the meeting change next week?
Oh, sorry, 2 p.m. Pacific next week, which would be September 22nd, and then we'll
Okay.
resume at noon Pacific on the 29th.
Okay.
Apologies if that change makes it so some of you can't join, but we will record.
Yeah. So Matt, I like what you just said about the how did you put it, the high temperature or intensity of a Zoom meeting, especially if you limit it to the hour, about the right time limit for keeping the conversation at that level. I really appreciate that. I appreciate a live meeting and what we can bring to each other in conversation and so on. But yeah, this other tool I've kind of become aware of recently called Volley. And I don't think it's a replacement for Zoom. I just think it's complementary, where this is a synchronous meeting. We're all here, if we can make the time zone and everything else. And where Volley is asynchronous. So yeah, we continue to have a conversation, but you can hop on and hop off exactly, just like social media, right? We're not all scrolling on Facebook at the exact same time as all our friends, but we're seeing what they posted earlier that day or yesterday, what have you, and then commenting on that. So it's more asynchronous. But yeah, I've discovered that app recently in another context in my life, but I find it a super tool for having a conversation, but as I say, in a different kind of time format and a different kind of energy to it. So if whoever's interested, I'm happy to host that space. And they're actually in the very, very, very near future, they're going to be switching to a freemium model. So if there is a cost, I'll be happy to host that cost as part of my contribution to this group. But yeah, so there it is. That's about a good introduction to what Volley is.
That's great, Jeff. I appreciate your offer to host that. that would be so helpful. And my other next question is, I see your hand, Angus, but let me just say, I've been blind copying everyone on the emails. A few of you have said, feel free to share your email. If I copy everyone in the next email, Jeff can then send us a link to the Volley page, which I'm pretty sure you can either use it in your browser, or you can download an app onto your computer, or you could use an app on your smartphone, I think. So there's different ways to access it. You don't need to download anything if you don't want to, but is everyone okay with emails being shared?
It's okay with me.
Great. Awesome. Okay, go ahead, Angus.
Yeah, I'd be interested to look into that Volley thing that you talked about, Jeff. I'm not aware of it yet, but actually, because of my own other experiences, I actually set up a community. I called it the Exceptional State, so like something taken directly from the philosophy of freedom, and really the intention was exactly to create some type of community where people with a deep interest, be it the like philosophical angle or the esoteric angles, like had a community board where they could post articles or sort of like post questions where people might just sort of like contribute. So if I understood what Jeff was saying, it's like a more immediate. I mean, there's the ability to do posts, but I've seen other communities which have actually ceased now, where often you might get a thread that sort of like spans 30, 40, 50, because people sort of like read it and they come to it and then they sort of like they add their thoughts. So you get sort of actually get these really long conversations. Now that service sort of like ceased about 6 months ago. It made a little bit of a splash like in that anthroposophical world because of a Italian guy, Cesare. Do you know him, Lorenzo Cesare? No, not ricordo. In any way, so I've seen the need to create something like that because I haven't been able to find it for myself. And a little bit like Jeff is saying there, at the moment I'm using the free model, which is perfectly adequate for posting so like questions or articles. But if a community grows out of that, I've also said to myself that I'm perfectly prepared to like stick more money in it if like more functionality is needed. So that's also there, and I think the best way for me to do that is just to sort of like to paste a link somewhere. You might have an idea where, Matt, and if people think it might be interesting, head on there and sort of like have a look. And if you like it, then sort of like just sign up and see what conversations can start in a slower format than sort of like permanent video conversations, if I understood Jeff's description correctly.
Right. Yeah. So for now, the hub would be the Patreon page, and no one's obligated to become a patron. It's all open and free. You can post text underneath each of the videos, which I'll upload there if you want to have some text-based conversation. And we can also share the link to the Volley thread once Jeff sets that up on Patreon. So that will be like our hub for now.
Okay. No.
Yeah. Matt, I see your hand up.
Hi. I don't know if we're just talking about logistics for the class, but I was wondering if it's okay to jump into the text real quick.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the book twice, Philosophy of Freedom, and these would probably be, I feel like these are big picture ideas, but I find it interesting in the text that Philosophy of Freedom is also translated as Philosophy of Spiritual Activity. I find that interesting how those can be synonymous, like in somebody's use. I guess this is kind of maybe a question to Angus or anybody else who's familiar with Philosophy of Freedom. Does that make sense to you as to why those would be synonymous? It does?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah. I mean, it's actually specifically on Steiner's recommendation for the English title. He considered that basically English-speaking people, they had like a level of freedom that had been achieved there that was still not that still didn't exist in Germany, hence the change of the words. And essentially, it's like once you dig into it, this exceptional state that I referred to a couple of minutes ago, essentially, so like it is spiritual activity. Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, well said, Angus. And again, to share the rationale that Ashton and I came up with for the ordering of the two texts, we're starting with Riddles of Philosophy, and then we're going to read Philosophy of Freedom subsequently, which obviously you're all welcome to stick around and join us for that next book too. We thought it would be good to have a grounding in the history of philosophy, even though Steiner wrote Philosophy of Freedom first, just to absorb, as someone put it, the history of philosophy and have that fresh in our minds, and then to engage Philosophy of Freedom as the task of thinking today, more or less. Steiner wrote it over 100 years ago, but it's still the task for thinking now, given our current position in the evolution of consciousness. Is that how you would say it, Ashton?
Sure. Yeah, and I don't know if anybody has read this already before, but just a quick look at the table of contents. The last chapter in the Riddles of Philosophy is a kind of sketch or introduction to anthroposophy and the sort of epistemology or method that I think is really being unfolded in the Philosophy of Freedom. So, yeah, or at least partially.
Yeah, so we have about 5 minutes. Are there any other comments or questions on the philosophical end of things? I think we've covered the necessary logistical issues.
I like the sequence of the first two books, as you just explained, Riddles and then Philosophy of Freedom. Do you have, it'll be decided as you go, I'm imagining, but do you have a kind of an overarching goal for this group? What kind of study you want to be guiding this through, or what future books could be in a goal like that? Or
we haven't thought much about it yet. I thought it would unfold as the group assembled and King Crest, to use another of my favorite philosophers' words, and that the path forward would reveal itself as we deepened into our sort of shared philosophical activity in these groups. I think Ashton and I are both very open, whether it's another book by Steiner or, we could start getting into the more like properly esoteric texts, Outline of Occult Sciences or something like that. But it's very open at this point. So I welcome any, intuitions or lures that emerge from anyone as we get towards the end of this book or as we get into the Philosophy of Freedom.
Yeah, I'd like to add something about the synonymity between spiritual activity and freedom, because the fact that freedom corresponds to something that is the activity of the level of spirit means is connected to the division in bodies of anthroposophy. You get a physical body, but also an etherical body and a psychical body and a spiritual body, and the ego, which is the spiritual body, is characterized by freedom, by the fact of being posed where alternatives lie, if one could say. The view, the panorama that the ego has is the panorama of alternatives, which is different from, let's say, the panorama of the body. And that's why spiritual activity was to Steiner a more exact translation for the title of his book.
Yeah, thanks for that, Lorenzo. So many things come to mind, but I have to save it for next time. I want to let Angus chime in and see how much time we have left.
It was just actually a quick question about the page that you mentioned there, Matt. Is it just comments on the videos, or is there like an open space for like other types of discussions that are like Steiner linked?
Good question. I think I can. I think I can create a page that would just be for open discussion. It doesn't necessarily need to be underneath any particular video. So I'll do that after our call.
Great, thanks.
Stuart.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I guess just personal expression, Zeno, that question of Zeno. I personally, I don't presume to be able to know what Parmenides, Zeno were really thinking. I tend to rely on people like Steiner and others, other scholars, to investigate that. I always feel like the best I can do is, what's it saying to me? What do I get out of it? And after a lot of thought about Zeno, it finally came to me. I mean, looking at different solutions, calculus solutions to Zeno's problems and those sorts of things, that what I finally got out of Zeno was, beware of your models. Beware of the abstract models you're using to apply to reality. And and then I came across Bergson, and I thought, all right, I got some agreement with a well-known gentleman, and and it seems to me, to connect up with another theme, that way of looking at it, that perhaps what we can take from Zeno is to beware of our models, does particularly apply to this period of time in philosophy, when we're struggling with different kinds of abstract models, which is being suggested by Steiner, and Barfield, taking the place of our actual participation and limiting our ability to participate in the reality we're actually a part of. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Such an important comment. Whitehead calls it the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, where we think the model is the reality. It's a great note to end on. This warning, Stuart's warning, not to mistake reality, the model for the reality. So take that with you this week. We're going to do chapter 3 next week, and look for some emails in the meantime to set up Volley and the recording of this. And yeah, so glad to have you all here. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you. Thanks, Matt.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ashton.
Bye.
Thank you.
It's nice meeting you all.